Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. On a map, they look like one block. Economically, they are four completely different machines. This is part 1 of 2. And in this video, we cover what the four genuinely share, and then the two countries that kept control of their own money. Norway, which found oil and did the one thing almost no other country managed. It refused to spend it. And Sweden, which had no windfall at all and built global companies instead. We will go through the sovereign wealth fund and the rule that protects it, the difference between being wealthy and being productive, the disease that hides inside a resource boom, the crisis that rebuilt Sweden, and the debt sitting quietly underneath the Swedish success story. No jargon, no complicated maths, just the real mechanics. Let's get into it. Look at a map of Northern Europe and you see one thing. A cluster of cold, rich, well-organized countries that seem to do everything right. Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. We talk about them as a single unit. The Nordics, Scandinavia, the Nordic model. And there is real truth in that. They do share a great deal, and we will spend the first few minutes on exactly what they share, because you cannot understand the differences without it. But here is the claim this video is built on. Underneath that shared surface sit four genuinely different economic machines, running on different fuel, exposed to different risks, and making completely different bets about the future. One found oil and saved almost all of it. One built global brands out of 10 million people. One deliberately gave up control of its own interest rates. And one joined the euro and then absorbed the hardest shock of the four. By the end of these two videos, you will never again see them as one block. Start with what genuinely unites them. All four run what people call the Nordic model, and at its heart is a bargain. Citizens accept some of the highest taxes in the world. In return, the state provides healthcare, education, childcare, parental leave, and old age security universally, to everyone, not just to the poor. That word universal matters more than people realize. When a benefit goes to everybody, including the middle class and the wealthy, everybody has a stake in defending its quality. A system only for the poor tends to become a poor system. The Nordics avoided that trap. And notice what the bargain is not. It is not socialism in the textbook sense. The state does not own the means of production. These are open, competitive, privately owned market economies, with some of the freest trade rules anywhere. The redistribution happens after the market has done its work, not instead of it. The second shared ingredient is harder to measure, but probably more important. Trust. Nordic societies consistently record some of the highest levels of trust in the world. Trust in strangers, in institutions, in government, in the tax authority. Corruption is low. Contracts are enforced. Public records are open. And this is not sentimental, it is economic. High trust cuts the cost of doing almost everything. You need fewer lawyers, less security, less verification, less bribery. You can run a generous welfare state without it collapsing under fraud, because most people genuinely pay what they owe and claim only what they are entitled to. Try transplanting the Nordic tax rates into a low-trust society, and the system breaks immediately because people evade and cheat. That is the single biggest reason the Nordic model is so hard to export. The taxes are the visible part. The trust is the part that actually makes it work. Here is a fact that stops people in their tracks. None of these four rich countries has a statutory national minimum wage. Not Norway, not Sweden, not Denmark, not Finland. If you assume that generous social democracies would legislate a wage floor, the opposite is true. So why are wages not driven into the ground? Because they are set somewhere else, through collective bargaining. Powerful trade unions negotiate directly with equally organized employer associations, industry by industry, and those agreements cover a very large share of the workforce. The floor exists, it is simply negotiated rather than legislated. And the unions defend that arrangement fiercely because a government-set minimum would make them less necessary. It is a completely different philosophy of how a labor market should be governed. Not the state imposing a rule from above, but two organized sides negotiating as equals, with the state staying out of the room. The last thing they share is a constraint rather than a virtue. All four are small, open economies. Norway has around 5.5 million people, Denmark and Finland each around 6, Sweden about 10.5. Put together, the entire region is smaller than many single cities. That size has two consequences that shape everything that follows. First, the domestic market is far too small to sustain a modern industrial economy on its own, so they must export, and their firms must be internationally competitive from the very beginning. Second, they are permanently exposed. A recession in Germany, a change in Chinese demand, a war on the European continent, an energy price shock. None of these are things a country of 6 million people can influence. They can only adapt. So the real question for each of these four economies is this. When the world hits you, what do you have to absorb the blow? And that is exactly where they part company. Start with Norway, and start before the money. For most of its modern history, Norway was the poor relation of Scandinavia. It was mountainous, hard to farm, thinly populated, and peripheral. It lived off fish, timber, and shipping. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, so many Norwegians emigrated to America that immigration became a national story in itself. Norway only became fully independent from Sweden in 1905. It was occupied during the Second World War, and it rebuilt afterwards as a competent but modest Northern European economy, poorer than Sweden and Denmark. Hold that picture, because it matters. Norway is not rich because Norwegians are uniquely brilliant, and it did not have some ancient advantage the others lacked. Within living memory, it was the least wealthy of the group. What changed was geology, and then, crucially, what Norway decided to do about it. In the 1960s, exploration began in the Norwegian sector of the North Sea. Early results were discouraging, and many gave up hope. Then, at the very end of the decade, came the discovery that changed the country, a vast offshore oil field, followed over the following years by more oil and enormous quantities of natural gas. Norway had, quite suddenly, become a major energy exporter. Now, this is the moment where history offers a warning. The list of countries that discovered oil and ended up worse off is long and depressing. Windfalls have funded corruption, propped up dictatorships, wrecked manufacturing, and left populations poorer after the boom than before it. Economists gave the pattern a name, the resource curse. Norway knew this. Its politicians and civil servants argued about it openly and early, before the serious money arrived, and they made a set of decisions that turned out to be worth more than the oil itself. The central decision was to build a wall between the oil revenue and the government's everyday spending. Norway created a sovereign wealth fund, formerly the Government Pension Fund Global. The state's petroleum income, taxes on the oil companies, its direct stake in production, dividends from the national energy company, flows into that fund rather than straight into the budget. And here is the crucial design choice. The fund invests almost entirely outside Norway. Every krone goes into foreign shares, foreign bonds, and foreign property. Today it holds roughly $1.8 trillion, which makes it the largest sovereign wealth fund on Earth. It owns, on average, in the region of 1.5% of every listed company in the world. Spread across the population, that is something like $300,000 of foreign assets per Norwegian citizen. A country of 5.5 million people is one of the largest shareholders on the planet. A big fund is not enough on its own. Plenty of countries have built one and then raided it the moment there was an election to win. So Norway added a rule. The government may normally transfer into the annual budget only around the fund's expected long-run real return, roughly 3%, and for many years the guideline was 4%. The capital itself stays invested. Read that carefully, because it is the whole trick. Norway spends the interest, not the inheritance. It converted a finite, depleting, physical resource into a permanent financial income stream that in principle never ends. And the rule has held for over 2 decades, across governments of the left and the right, which is arguably more impressive than the money. There is flexibility in a crisis, and spending did rise sharply during the pandemic, but the norm reasserts itself. The fund's holdings are published in detail and independently audited, so any Norwegian can look up exactly what their country owns. Now, why invest it all abroad? At first glance it seems perverse. Norway has roads to build and hospitals to staff. So why send the money to New York and Tokyo? There are 2 reasons, and both are pure macroeconomics. The first is capacity. If you inject $1 trillion into an economy of 5.5 million people, you do not get $1 trillion of extra output. You get inflation. There are only so many builders, engineers, and nurses. Demand surges into a fixed supply, and prices explode. The second reason is the exchange rate, and it leads directly to the danger we are coming to. Converting that foreign currency into Norwegian krone to spend at home would push the krone up sharply, and a strong krone makes every Norwegian export more expensive abroad. By keeping the money offshore, in foreign currency, Norway protects both its price level and its exporters. Now the distinction that almost everyone misses, and the one that makes Norway make sense. Norway sits at or near the top of European income rankings. But much of Norway's exceptional income reflects petroleum revenues, while the mainland economy is less exceptional. Norwegian statisticians take this so seriously that they publish a separate figure for it. Mainland Norway, which strips out petroleum extraction, pipeline transport, and ocean shipping to show what the rest of the country actually produces. And measured that way, Norway looks like a strong, well-run, ordinary Nordic economy, broadly comparable to its neighbors, rather than a runaway winner. This is the difference between wealth and productivity. Wealth is what you own, the fund, the reserves, the accumulated assets. Productivity is what you can produce per hour of work. Norway is extraordinarily wealthy. Its productivity outside the resource is good, but it is not magic. Separate those two ideas, and the whole picture clarifies. Which brings us to Norway's real long-run risk, and it has a name economists have used for half a century. Dutch disease. It is named after the Netherlands, which found large gas reserves and then watched its manufacturing sector struggle. The mechanism runs like this. A resource boom pours foreign currency and demand into the economy. The currency strengthens in real terms. Wages rise across the whole country because the resource sector can afford to pay almost anything and everyone else must compete for the same workers. And then your factories, your engineering firms, your software companies find they simply cannot compete internationally on cost. The resource does not just dominate the economy, it quietly crowds everything else out. Norway has fought this deliberately, which is precisely why the fund invests abroad. But Norwegian cost levels are high, and for decades the most talented engineers and the most capital were pulled toward petroleum. So Norway's defining question is not whether it is rich. It plainly is. The question is what the mainland economy looks like on the day petroleum stops being the center of the story, whether through depletion or far more likely through the world's energy transition away from fossil fuels. Norway is unusually well prepared for that day because the fund means the wealth survives even if the oil demand does not. But a fund pays for consumption. It does not by itself create competitive industries or high-productivity jobs or the next generation of exporters. That has to be built. Norway knows this, and it talks about it constantly, investing in offshore wind, carbon capture, aquaculture, and technology. Whether that is enough is genuinely unresolved. It is the single biggest open question in the Norwegian economy, and it will be answered over the next few decades. One more thing sets Norway apart politically, and it has real economic consequences. Norway is not a member of the European Union. Norwegians voted on membership twice, in 1972 and again in 1994, and rejected it both times, largely over fishing rights, farming, and sovereignty. Instead, Norway participates in the European Economic Area, which gives it full access to the single market, and it accepts a large body of European rules in order to trade freely. So the practical position is unusual. Norway follows much of the rulebook while sitting outside the room where the rules are written. It has sovereignty over fisheries and agriculture and its own currency, the krone, which floats freely. That floating krona matters enormously, and when the oil price falls, the krone tends to weaken, cushioning the rest of the economy automatically. Hold that thought, because Denmark and Finland made the opposite choice. So what is Norway's transferable lesson? It is emphatically not find oil. The lesson is institutional, and there are 4 parts. Ring-fence the windfall, so that today's politicians cannot spend tomorrow's inheritance. Invest it abroad, so the money does not inflate your own economy or destroy your exporters. Bind yourself to a spending rule and then actually keep to it for decades through changes of government. And be radically transparent so that citizens can see exactly what is held and what is spent. Notice that not one of those four requires oil or even wealth. They require institutional discipline and public trust. That is why Norway is studied by every resource-rich country on Earth, and why so few have managed to copy it. The hard part was never the geology. Now cross the border into Sweden, and the entire logic of the economy changes. Sweden has no oil fund and no windfall. It has about 10.5 million people, roughly the population of a single large metropolitan area. And yet, list what this country has sent into the world. IKEA reshaped how ordinary people furnish a home. Volvo built a global reputation on safety. Ericsson helped build the mobile networks the world runs on. H&M changed high street fashion. Spotify changed how humanity listens to music. Klarna reshaped online payments. Minecraft became one of the best-selling games ever made. That is an absurd output for 10 million people, and it is not luck, because luck does not repeat itself across 7 decades and 6 industries. It is a system, and the system has identifiable parts. The first part is that Swedish companies are built for export from the first day. When your home market is 10 million people, a product that only works in Sweden is not a business. So Swedish firms design for international markets immediately, and they have done so since the industrial era, when companies grew up around Swedish iron, ore, timber, and engineering. 2 practical advantages compound this. English proficiency in Sweden is exceptionally high because television and film are subtitled rather than dubbed, and English is taught early and seriously, so a Swedish startup can sell into Britain or America without a language barrier. And Sweden has long been deeply integrated into European supply chains. The result is an economy where exports account for a very large share of output, and where being internationally competitive is not an ambition but a precondition for existing at all. The second part is investment in the things that make future products possible. Sweden spends heavily on research and development relative to the size of its economy, consistently among the highest shares in the world, and importantly, a large part of that is business spending rather than government spending, which tends to translate more directly into products. On top of that sits an unusually digital population. Sweden rolled out broadband early and widely, and in the 1990s it ran a scheme that helped ordinary households buy home computers, seeding a generation that grew up online well before most of the world. Sweden is now close to a cashless society. What that gives you is a domestic test market that adopts new technology fast, so a Swedish digital product gets battle-tested at home and then goes global. Spotify and Klarna are exactly that pattern. But the Swedish story has a hinge, and it is a catastrophe. In the late 1980s, Sweden deregulated credit without properly strengthening supervision. Lending exploded, property prices soared, and the whole thing was balanced on a currency pegged to a basket of European currencies. In 1992, the bubble burst. Property collapsed, banks faced insolvency, and speculators attacked the krona. The central bank defended the peg by raising its overnight rate to an almost unbelievable 500%. It still failed. Sweden was forced to abandon the fixed exchange rate and let the krona float. Output fell, unemployment rose sharply, and the public finances were devastated. That crisis is the most important single event in modern Swedish economic history, because Sweden's response to it built the country that exists today. Out of that wreckage came the first great decision. Sweden kept its own currency, and it let it float. It gave the central bank, the Riksbank, formal independence and a clear inflation target. And later, when the euro arrived, Sweden held a referendum in 2003 and voted no. It remains in the European Union with its own floating currency. Why does that matter so much? Because a floating currency is a shock absorber. When Sweden is hit by a downturn, the krona tends to weaken. Swedish exports automatically become cheaper on world markets, which supports output and jobs without anyone having to negotiate a wage cut. And the central bank can set interest rates for Swedish conditions rather than for a continent. The cost is real, a floating currency swings, and imports get more expensive when it falls. Sweden decided that price was worth paying. The second thing Sweden did after the crisis is the part that annoys both political sides. It reformed hard, and it did so while keeping the welfare state. It adopted strict fiscal rules with a surplus target and expenditure ceilings, and it ran budget surpluses for years, cutting public debt dramatically. It rebuilt the pension system so that payouts adjust automatically to life expectancy and economic performance, meaning the system rebalances itself instead of silently bankrupting future taxpayers. It opened parts of public service provision to competition. Some of those reforms remain genuinely contested inside Sweden, particularly the school reforms. But the macroeconomic point stands. Sweden is not evidence that big government works, and it is not evidence that free markets work. It is evidence that a welfare state survives only if you are willing to keep redesigning it. Now, the uncomfortable part of the Swedish story. Swedish households carry some of the highest debt burdens in the developed world, commonly measured at close to twice their annual disposable income. The cause is housing. Sweden's cities have not built enough homes for decades. The rental market is tightly regulated, which keeps rents below market levels for those inside, but produces famously long queues for anyone outside, waits measured in years in Stockholm. So for most people, buying is the only realistic route to a home. Add a long period of very low interest rates and mortgages that were often interest-heavy with slow amortization, and prices rose far faster than incomes. Sweden has tightened mortgage rules and amortization requirements in response, but the accumulated stock of debt does not disappear quickly. Why does household debt matter at the level of the whole economy? Because it changes how Sweden transmits an interest rate rise. Swedish mortgages have historically carried short fixed periods or variable rates, so when the central bank raises rates, monthly payments rise quickly for a very large number of households. Those households then cut spending on everything else, fast. The result is an economy unusually sensitive to monetary tightening, where a rate rise reaches the shops within months rather than years. There is a second vulnerability too. When so much national wealth is concentrated in housing, a serious price correction hits consumer confidence, construction employment, and bank balance sheets simultaneously. Sweden's innovation story is entirely real. So is the leverage sitting underneath it, and any honest account has to hold both at once. So Sweden's lesson is about adaptability rather than resources. It shows that a small country with no windfall can produce world-class companies if it educates people well, invests in research, stays radically open to trade, and builds firms for export from day one. It shows that a welfare state and fierce private competition are not opposites. And it shows something harder. That the reforms which saved the Swedish model were only politically possible because of a crisis severe enough to make doing nothing more frightening than doing something. That is the uncomfortable pattern in economic history. Countries rarely reform at the peak. They reform in the wreckage. Sweden's achievement was to use its wreckage well, and then to keep the discipline for 30 years afterwards. Let's pull part one together. The four Nordic countries genuinely do share a model. High taxes exchanged for universal services, unusually high trust that makes such a system possible, wages set by collective bargaining rather than by a legal minimum, and the permanent exposure that comes from being small and open. Norway then took a resource windfall and, almost uniquely, saved it. It walled the money off from the budget, invested it abroad to protect its own prices and exporters, and bound itself to spending only the return. But much of its exceptional income reflects petroleum, while the mainland economy is more ordinary, and Dutch disease remains the long-run risk. Sweden had no windfall. It built export-driven companies, invested heavily in research, and after the crisis of 1992 it floated the krona, made its central bank independent, fixed its budget rules, and redesigned its pensions. Its weak point is household debt built on a housing shortage. Two countries, two completely different engines, and both still holding the steering wheel on their own monetary policy. In part two we cross to the other side of the argument. The two countries that gave up monetary independence. Denmark, which pegs its krone to the euro and therefore follows interest rates set in Frankfurt, runs the famous flexicurity labor market, and now carries a concentration risk that shows up in its national statistics. And Finland, the only Nordic country inside the euro, which lost Nokia and its Russian trade at almost the same moment and had to adjust the hard way, through wages and prices, because it had no currency left to fall. We will finish with the weaknesses, all for share, and the honest scoreboard. If this video helped you, please do 2 quick things. Share it with someone who thinks Scandinavia is all the same. It genuinely helps more than you would think. And subscribe, so part 2 reaches you when it lands. Thank you for watching all the way through. See you in part 2.